Liar. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Monday, June 14th, Flag Day, as it happens, June 14th, 2021. I hope you are all appropriately in solemn dress. Perhaps black would be great. I know that's not the colors of the flag, but remember, this is the flag's day, not yours. Don't be showing off. And I suppose, just like Memorial Day, this is supposed to be a solemn occasion, and we're supposed to be thanking everyone for their service and not saying anything happy, because, I don't know, flag. And so, therefore, it must be something somber about it. There can be no happy occasions when it comes to patriotism and flags, I think. That may or may not be the new rule. We'll see how things go. And, of course, rules are different for Eastern Orthodox Flag Day tomorrow. But, well, you know, things seem to be okay this morning. I'm looking around, just trying to check how many mass shooting clouds there might be out there. None that have risen to the level of national consciousness for this morning. Not that there weren't a few over the weekend. There are always at least a few. That's just the way it is here in America. But okay, we'll catch up with Greg Dworkin in a few minutes, and he'll have the big news roundup. The Kagro in the Morning radio show is live, we are told, from Portland, Maine, thanks to Bill. Kagro X, me, David Waldman, complains. Oh, good. It's my favorite thing to do. That President Biden hasn't sent him a having fun, wish you were here postcard from London. Yeah, that was waiting on that one, but yesterday was Sunday, no mail delivery. And Louis DeJoy is still in office, so there may not be ever be mail delivery again, for all I know. Or maybe he did, right? And Louis DeJoy is sitting on it. Either way, there's going to be cuss words, and Louis DeJoy really among the top cuss words I can think of for this morning. All right, rounding things up, it's going to be an interesting Monday. We have to unravel the weekend's stories about the Justice Department's work in seeking communications metadata. We learned by the end of the week, last week, that the subpoenas of internet service providers, of Apple, etc., have gotten around to collecting communications metadata from Adam Schiff and from other Democratic members of the House Intelligence Committee, staffers of the committee, the family members, including one minor child of committee members. And over the weekend, the story expanded to include Don McGahn, former White House counsel to Donald Trump, which is kind of an interesting direction for things to go. And we'll have to unravel things because just as people were getting exercised about it, Marcy Wheeler chimed in to say that there was a reason, and we'll see if we can unravel what the reason is, that this was all not a very big deal at all, or at least the Don McGahn portion of things was not a big deal. And well, as usual, if you join things midstream, it didn't necessarily make a great deal of sense. And I have no particular inclination to save the Trump administration or alums of the Trump administration from being attacked and suffering discomfort at the hands of, well, any mob that might choose to dish it out to them, quite frankly, would probably meet with my approval at least immediately. As I look into their backgrounds, we might find reasons to differentiate. But at any rate, anything that causes disruption and discomfort for them is worth taking a look at. And I have no particular interest in letting anybody off the hook over these things, but I guess Marcy does. And if you have some particular interest in that, you can check in on it, and perhaps we'll point you in the right direction. All right. Much to catch up on, as I mentioned, and almost certainly among the raft of stories today, we'll probably have to check in on those folks in Israel again, as I guess the formality of finally replacing Netanyahu as prime minister has taken place over the weekend. And what better time to do it? I don't know. I have no real reason to believe that can't be done during the week, but it wasn't. And people are enjoying the fact that he's removed from power, even if no real prospects of an Israeli government moving forward, let's say, I don't know, in any more, progressive friendly direction. I doubt that will be coming at any point. But we'll check in on what's going on there and what is emerging from the confusion. Apparently, Netanyahu took the opportunity to make a parting shot speech as well. I didn't read the contents, the substance of the speech, but I did notice that over the weekend, Israel watching Twitter was aghast. Wow, my goodness. Oh, yes, I remember now. I have to turn down the sound on this thing. Whoops, I better answer it real quick so I can get to that. I think I pumped up the sound when last week we were trying to, I guess, play something via Firefox, and they all go through the same sound box. So that was quite loud and disruptive. But now we're okay. Greg Dworkin is here. I bet Greg has a better handle on exactly what it was that Netanyahu said, but I did see a lot of Twitter reaction.
Well, it was loud and disruptive, so I think you got that exactly right.
That's probably what it was. That was the speech. It sounded like music and bells, but it was actually Hebrew. And those of you who don't recognize it, well, it's an exotic language, and it's very odd sounding. So
right, but you have to speak it from right to left to make it make any sense. That's the whole thing.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of info in the pundit roundup today.
Ah, okay.
And I gave some examples of what was going on here. So Naftali Bennett was sworn in yesterday as Israel's new prime minister, and the old prime minister didn't leave with flourishes and glad handing, let's just say.
All right.
So what happened is that on Sunday yesterday, they had the formal vote, the confidence vote in the new government, which won by one vote. And so Netanyahu leaves, and Naftali Bennett and his very diverse group of ministers come in.
Yes.
Women, disabled ministers, gay ministers, but as somebody who was tweeting the picture of them in a group photo noted, no indicted ministers, at least not at the moment.
Who's going to represent the indicted? And
the handover work meeting, Gil Hoffman points out, has begun today.
All right.
As Neri Zilber points out, imagine looking at the new Israeli government with Meretz back in power, Labor back in power, Arab Israeli Party in power for the first time. Yair Lapid is the real power in the coalition, even though Naftali Bennett is the current prime minister. They trade fascists and settler rabbis and ultra-Orthodox out of power, and Netanyahu thrown into the opposition and thinking nothing has changed.
All right. Yeah.
Well, a lot has changed.
Does seem
right?
like
and so what happened is that the first speech, they had like 3 or 4 hours of speeches before they had the vote. And one of the first speeches, in terms of the order in which they went, was Naftali Bennett. And as he stood up to speak, Likud and the Netanyahu faction heckled him and were completely disruptive and basically had to be escorted out of the building. They snuck back in, and then they were escorted out again. But they wouldn't let him speak.
Insurrection. Oh. Well,
and so when it was time for Yair Lapid, who is the co-prime minister, he gets to go in 2 years if the government lasts that long.
Yeah, that's
and he throws his speech out.
Oh.
And he doesn't speak he speaks, but he doesn't speak in terms of what he was going to say.
Okay.
Instead, right, he stands up. I'll read his full speech because it's very short. He stands up and said, Mr. Speaker, Knesset members, I'm skipping this speech I planned to deliver today because I'm here to say one thing, to ask forgiveness from my mother.
Oh.
My mother's 86 years old, and we don't ask her to come to Jerusalem lightly, but we did it because I assumed you would be able to get over yourselves and behave with statesmanship at this moment, and she would see a smooth transition to government. When she was born, there was no state of Israel. Tel Aviv was a small town. I wanted her to be proud of the democratic process in Israel. Instead, she, along with every citizen of Israel, is ashamed of you and remembers clearly why it's time to replace you. Thank you. And he sat down.
Oh. All right.
He's obviously the best politician of the group. As Judah Ari Gross reports, Yair Lapid is cold-blooded, giving up his opportunity to speak and thus denying members of the opposition to be the chance to interrupt him. The speech was so short they didn't have a chance to heckle him. They were thrown out. They hadn't gotten back to their seats. They were ready to. They were all set. They wanted to. They wanted to disrupt, but they couldn't because, like, he wouldn't let them. And so the pro tip there is always act like your mom is watching because, like, you'd be a better person if you were.
Right, until they find out, his mom wasn't really in the audience. He's a liar. We have to get rid of him because he's a liar.
Right. So those are the interesting things that happened. And, things are happening. And things are not only happening there. Things are happening on the international stage as well. Dave Rothkopf has a nice piece in the Daily Beast about Biden's G7 and NATO visits. NATO's today. G7 was over the weekend.
All right.
Right. Biden made it clear that in his private meetings that America's central geopolitical concern right now is China. This is a source of some tension with Europeans who don't want to be drawn into what some see as a budding U.S.-China Cold War, but certainly it's clear that Russia, exiled from the G7 because of its invasion of Ukraine, is important but not central. And in terms of meeting with Russia, which comes next after the NATO meetings, that'll be Wednesday, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan set the mood. Before departing for the trip, Joe Biden is not meeting with Putin despite our country's differences. He's meeting with him because of our country's differences. The Biden team believes it's in Putin's interest to make the meeting a success. They also emphasize Biden's not looking to dunk on him. These men know each other. Biden's approaching this with a long term in mind. And basically, if you speak to the diplomats, as Rothkopf did, I didn't, I'm reading his report, they're delighted with how it went. And they were totally happy, as you could see from Macron when asked about it. A reporter said to Biden, do you think the U.S. is back? And Biden said, I don't know. Ask Macron here.
Oh.
And Macron said, definitely.
Oh, may we?
So there you have it. May we?
Right.
So, basically it went well. They were happy to see him. They're happy to get back to the hard work of actually being united. And that united front, however fragile, is exactly what they want to tell Putin. So that's the message. Whatever they say at the actual summit matters a lot less. He's not Trump. He's doing the hard work before and after, and I think that's part of the whole deal. But the other interesting part about Rothkopf's piece is he also spoke to diplomats about how Vice President Kamala Harris's visit to south of our border went, and with a very interesting, different perspective. Instead of, constantly yelling at her for saying the wrong thing because she's not doing what you're supposed to do because people have an idea of what vice presidents are supposed to do. Diplomats with whom I spoke, said Rothkopf, also added that among the heaviest diplomatic lifts of the week was the one managed by Vice President Kamala Harris during her trip to Mexico and Guatemala. Despite the superficial coverage in the press, Harris arrived in Mexico after 4 years of Trump talking about building a wall, deploying troops to the border, separating families, and worse. For all those caught up in the tone Harris used with an NBC reporter, let's try to remember that Trump raised the idea of building a moat filled with alligators between the two countries. Right? In the wake of this, Harris had great meetings with the Mexican president, who called him transcendent. The agreement of the Mexicans to enter into a meaningful cabinet-level security dialogue with the U.S. was a major breakthrough. So, too, was Mexican agreement to help stem the flow of refugees into the U.S., including their participation in efforts to work with Central American governments on addressing the root cause. Restoring funding to programs focused on those root causes and setting up centers to help process legal migrants in Central America were concrete achievements of her Central American trip. While the press got hung up on her admonition to refugees not to come, it neglected that she said in the same sentence they should pursue legal channels of entry into the U.S., a politically fraught trip that also involved undoing a huge amount of damage inflicted by the prior administration. In that respect, what you saw from both the president and the vice president and their teams was something much more important than the meeting with any individual world leader. It was a coordinated, professionally managed, goal-oriented, long-term, realistic, experience-based, mature U.S. foreign policy being implemented. So smart America is back, folks.
Okay, it's our turn.
Real America, just sit down. You're not ready to do foreign relations yet. Thank you.
Yeah, well,
you're important. There's things that we should include you with. This isn't part of it.
You don't like this stuff anyway. Let the eggheads do it.
Let the eggheads do it. Exactly right. So I thought that was actually pretty insightful, and it's rare to actually try to look at what Harris is doing from a professional diplomat point of view, rather than, she said this thing, which I could put on cable TV and take it out of context and make her sound like we don't think that she's ready for the job. In fact, this is what she did.
Okay. Hey, it went okay compared. Like I think that makes the point very well. Compared to moats filled with alligators, it was hard
Hey,
not to do well.
not just
Really.
that. I'm old enough to remember Nelson Rockefeller as vice president making trips and getting stones thrown at him.
Oh well, okay. I don't remember that, but I guess I technically could be old enough to remember it. I just don't.
Yeah, well.
All right, I think I was
it
very
happens.
young.
So,
Hey, what do I know?
you're old
CRT
enough to
is a
remember
cathode ray
George
tube,
Bush
as far as
getting
I know.
shoes thrown at him.
Yeah, that's true. That part I remember. Okay. There's a good history of throwing things at presidents and vice presidents. Two things. That's two things is a history. One thing is the thing that happened.
Okay, I got this great picture I happened to stumble across, which I'm going to see if I can try and download for you just to send it.
Okay.
But it's a picture of Nelson Rockefeller. Mm-hmm. Okay. A quintessential Republican white guy. Okay, we may point out.
Yes.
Giving hecklers the middle finger.
All right.
So when you talk about how vice presidents are supposed to act, let's just say different people get judged by different standards and leave it at that.
I guess so. Let's take a look at this thing here. I'm anxious for this photo.
Oh,
there it is. Yeah. That's it. That's the thing.
Yeah, he gleefully gave them the middle finger. And so, don't lecture me about what vice presidents are supposed to do and how they're supposed to act.
Okay. Man, that is one warm bucket of spit there.
Yeah, I would
Holy
think so.
cow.
Anyway, there are two interesting articles in terms of foreign policy and
Yes.
what's going on in Israel. One of them is in the New York Times, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, which talks about the fall, the rise and fall, and continued presence of Bibi Netanyahu, which just makes the point that he's an extremely skilled politician who basically came in as Kennedy and left as Nixon.
Oof.
But either way, at either end, you make a splash. And one from Haaretz, the Israeli paper, Naftali Bennett, next Israeli PM, the man behind the slogans and the stereotypes, very interesting fellow. You'll hear a lot about, Bennett is even more right-wing than Netanyahu. On certain things, maybe.
I heard that.
He's certainly an ultra-nationalist, but he's not ultra-Orthodox. He wears a yarmulke, a kippah. But has a very interesting background. His parents were American. He was born in Israel, then lived in Canada, then went back to Israel. And a lot of ambivalence built into who he is, which is interesting because it gives him a lot of freedom to do things that perhaps more rigid people can't do. This segment from a behind a paywall piece sums it up. In Haaretz, the same goes for his personal background. He wears a tiny kippah, that's a yarmulke, a headpiece,
Yes.
improbably perching on his bald head with the help of two-sided tape, in case you were wondering how people keep it on. Sometimes
syrup,
bobby pins are used if you have hair, but he doesn't, so you use two-sided tape. But that doesn't define him or his family. He has American parents and spent part of his early childhood in New York and Montreal, but he's at most an ambivalent Anglo. As a self-professed fanatic of the greater land of Israel, which means he's into annexation, he's never shown much interest in actually living in the West Bank. He built a house in the placid, upscale Tel Aviv suburb. And in a visit to the Chabad Center in Haifa 5 years ago, Bennett described how his parents, who emigrated from San Francisco in 1967 following the Six-Day War, began keeping kosher and observing Shabbat because of him. Naftali was born in Haifa in 1972, and when he was 3, the family moved to Canada, where his father worked as a fundraiser for the Haifa-based Technion Technology Institute. The toddler was placed in a Chabad kindergarten so he could keep up his Hebrew, and he came home basically religious, how he tells the story.
I see.
And I asked my father why he wasn't religious, and we slowly began observing more, going to synagogue, keeping kashrut. But it just highlights a lot of the ambivalence about things. He comes from the settler movement, but he doesn't want to live in the settlement. For example, he comes from a relatively religious background, but is not totally on board with the idea that the ultra-Orthodox groups, kids shouldn't serve in the army, which is a huge flashpoint in Israel.
Okay.
And just to give you an idea of how the religious parties are approaching this, there's a group shot of the new ministers. I think I mentioned with the diversity. But when the ultra-Orthodox party, one of them, showed the same picture, they had the women's faces blurred out.
Oh, okay.
They wouldn't show the faces of women who were serving in government. I mean, and that's Bennett's own group. And to give you an idea of the kind of opposition he gets from the ultra-Orthodox. So just labeling him as, well, he's an ultra-Orthodox settler doesn't begin to pick at the actual complexity of who he is. So we shall see.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what I make
I'm
of
no
his
fan.
not
Don't get
living
me
in
wrong. This is not a left-wing government. That's why Tom Friedman's comparison to Netanyahu is Trump and everybody else throwing him out as Biden is so ridiculous. Netanyahu isn't Trump. He's Trumpy, but, he's more Nixon than Trump. And, more wily, smarter, and, going out in disgrace the same way. And Naftali Bennett is nothing whatsoever like Biden in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, well, it doesn't seem that. I don't know what I make of his not living in the settlements. The settlers don't want to live in the settlements. They want to live in, places that are more expensive and exclusive. But that's where it's affordable because you're stealing the land for your house.
Well, no, it's not that it's affordable.
It's not a good place.
You have to go and build there in order to establish your state. So part of what they're doing.
Yes, they definitely have an ideological part of it. But all told, I mean, there are some who are there because it's a settlement.
You have me living in a swamp? You think I like living in a swamp? I want to live in the swamp because, X, Y, and Z. Yeah, I suppose. Okay. But again, the last thing in the world I want to do is to get into settler politics. I'm just pointing out that trying to label him as
that's
something simplistic isn't going to work because, he brings a remarkably complicated points of view depending upon, who you are and what you want right now.
Okay. Well, we did learn something. Bald Canadian Orthodox men don't use necessarily maple syrup to have their kippah stay on their head. It's double-sided tape.
Go.
Okay. Did he borrow? It's like Trump with his ties. Although I don't know whether he used double-sided. No, I guess he didn't use double-sided tape. He should have, because then his tie would have stuck down instead of flapping in the breeze. But now he can pick that up from Bennett. There you go. Now the two of them can be friends.
Yeah, I found the picture of the women's ministers' faces being blanked out, so I'll send that to you so you can send it along to your roundup folks. When
just
you do
by way of proof that it happened, because you won't be able to tell who they are because their faces are blurred out. But
right.
Oh, I had seen a different one too. So they're doing this on all of them.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well, that seems like an awful waste of time. But
in any case, in a speech at the foreign ministry, Yair Lapid, the guy who gave that really abbreviated pundit roundup kind of speech,
right,
vows to repair Israel's relationship with the Democratic Party. The Republicans are important to us. Their friendship is important to us, but not only the friendship of the Republican Party, he said. Well, the management of the relationship with the Democratic Party in the United States was careless and dangerous. This is a direct quote. I've warned against it more than once, but the outgoing government took a terrible gamble, reckless and dangerous, to focus exclusively on the Republican Party and abandon Israel's bipartisan standing. The Republicans are important to us. Their friendship is important to us, but not only the friendship of the Republicans. We find ourselves with a Democratic White House, Senate, and House, and they are angry. We need to change the way we work with them. So again, that alone, if you were wondering why this national domestic politics show is focusing on Israeli politics, that's why.
Yes. Well, okay. True. And it's a good point. And, unmentioned in all of that is most of America's Jews. Also, part of that same party. And maybe it would be wise to maintain a relationship. Okay.
No, might come in handy later.
Yeah. Okay. That is odd. But, that helps connect us back. It brings us back around to our own politics. Do you know anything about that?
Our own politics?
Yeah.
Well, we'll talk about that after the break.
Okay.
And the last piece I'm going to do, just to summarize it all, this is a guest essay in the New York Times today, which I just stumbled across, which is called, Did Israel Just Have a Constitutional Revolution?
Oh. That's a good question.
Right?
Yeah.
It's getting a lot of
Seems
attention,
so.
mostly for one reason. Benjamin Netanyahu is out,
Right.
but the new government is potentially just as significant for another reason. We've mentioned this on the show, so I feel like I've kept our
good.
listeners up to date. It's the beginning of an era in which Israel no longer truly has a prime minister. Now, nominally, Israel's new prime minister is Naftali Bennett, but since a small right-wing party controls only 6 of the 120 seats in the Knesset, in the parliament there, it needs partners. The coalition now includes 7 additional parties from across the ideological spectrum, and they agree on just about nothing, very little, as they say in the article. What they do agree on is Mr. Bennett should not represent them for the duration of the term. Instead, in 2 years, he's supposed to relinquish control to Yair Lapid, the leader of the center-left party, and herein lies the constitutional revolution. Mr. Bennett is a partial prime minister now. Mr. Lapid will be a partial prime minister in 2 years. In reality, neither can do anything without the consent of the other because of a law that in practice gives each veto power. You know what this reminds me of? Schumer and McConnell.
Yeah. In a way.
So the result is something more like the ancient Roman system of 2 consuls and less like the traditional Israeli system of 1 prime minister.
Okay.
Now, a unity government with a rotating prime minister is not an original idea. In the 80s, Israel was ruled by a highly successful unity government under Yitzhak Shamir of the Likud party and Shimon Peres of Labor. But at that time, there was no alternative prime minister as there is in the Bennett-Lapid government. So they had to navigate the partnership without a legal arrangement, and they just went ahead and did it. So just the way Tom Daschle had to figure out how to power share.
Yeah. Well, this will be really interesting to watch, and I'll be curious to see how well it works out. I mean, the idea of, well, I'll be prime minister, you'll be prime minister later. Like, well, the government could fall at any time.
Well, you know, the point is sometimes power sharing works and sometimes it doesn't.
All right. Well, let's see how this one does.
And then we'll talk about domestic
Market Set Go.
Hi everyone, it's me, Gil. Minimal contributor to content, but regular contributor to funding for Kagro in the morning. Let's change things up from David's so very tired plea for your contributions with a plea of my own. If you want to add your voice to the show, do it. Record your own segment using your favorite recording device and send it to David. Read an article and give your opinion. Write your own essay and read that. The sky's the limit. Well, not really. Try to keep it relatively short so David doesn't have to stress about cutting it and hurting your feelings. Join the hallowed ranks of Greg Dworkin and Joan McCarter and be part of this somewhat witty deep dive into political topics with unnecessary censoring. Lend your voice to the show by sending it to kagrox@gmail.com. KAGROX@gmail.com.
Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We continue with our news roundup, our Monday news roundup, where all the news that happens over the weekend gets covered, except for that which doesn't. That's our motto.
Right, that we do Wednesday, unless you do it Tuesday, in which case sometimes we cover it on Thursday. So I was just looking things up to get dates right. I like to do those sorts of things. It turns out that it was 1969 that Nelson Rockefeller had a couple of 4 goodwill trips to Latin America, which sparked violent responses, which gives you an idea of how well the goodwill went.
Yeah.
So it actually did happen. But again, you know, in terms of looking to see what presidents do, what they're supposed to do, how they're treated, it's just a fascinating thing. Especially when you decide that for reasons of your own, you're going to hold up one to completely different standards than you did to everyone else.
Yes, well, only one asked for alligators.
Yeah, I suppose. Anyway, lots of other things going on. This week, for example, there is, and here we'll continue with today's theme of adventures and things I don't know that much about but seem interesting to me.
Okay.
This is the Southern Baptist Convention week, and there has been a lot of very, very public splits and arguments between the very conservative Southern Baptists and the ultra-conservative Southern Baptists in terms of fighting for control over the convention. But over the past decade or so, a lot of people, like 500,000, have left the Southern Baptist Convention altogether. There's a move on to, quote, retake, end quote, the Southern Baptist Convention by the ultra-conservatives who feel like the conservatives just aren't rightist enough.
They're not ultra.
So they're not happy with, trying to mollify and somehow learn to live with modern life. So that's going to be interesting. In this graph from Ryan Burge, and there's a piece on it in the Washington Post today by Sarah Pulliam-Bailey. In this graph from Ryan Burge, you can see that white Catholics and the white United Methodists didn't shift very much politically, but white Southern Baptists have since the Obama years becoming way much more Republican than they were. They started like 52, 53%. Now they're way into the 70s in terms of how they identify themselves, whereas other denominations really didn't change at all. The share of white Southern Baptists, in fact, who identify as Republicans went from about 50% in 2008 to 71% in 2018.
Oh.
So this isn't about liberals versus conservatives or Democrats versus Republicans, but many people feel, she writes, that how the convention votes will make a larger statement about the convention, whether it's a social and political affinity group or one united by common Christian commitments. So the great reckoning in Southern Baptist Convention is about to take place, she writes. More than 16,000 Southern Baptists gathered to hear what's going on there.
Well, okay. I mean,
just, there'll be stories that are coming.
I don't wish any of you good luck or anything.
You've been alerted to the fact you should be watching for stories later in the week.
That's right. Where are the northern, eastern, and western Baptists? Where the moderate Baptists?
I don't know.
We'll have to ask. We know where the Baptists
but I'll tell
are.
you a Methodist story. Only it's Houston Methodist. It's a hospital.
Okay.
This is a hospital that has about 25,000 employees, and somewhere less than 200, maybe 170 or so, said you can't make us take this COVID vaccine.
Oh. Are they right?
We're going to sue. And you can't make us do it, first of all, because it's experimental, and secondly, it's just like the Holocaust.
Oh, well, yeah. I know about number
U.S.
two.
District Judge
That's
Lynn
not right.
Hughes rejected the argument in his ruling in favor of Houston Methodist. He said the lawsuits claim that the vaccines are experimental and dangerous is false and irrelevant.
Okay.
And the hospital system's requirement does not violate state or federal law or public policy. And the judge took particular issue with the complaint equating the mandate to medical experimentation during the Holocaust, calling the comparison reprehensible.
That's a bad one. It's not as bad as the original. Like, I was puzzling over that. Well, let me see. Now, in the Holocaust, they killed people, and in the vaccination thing, they're trying to not kill people. So in that sense, it seems un-Holocaust-y.
Well, that's funny. That's what the judge said.
Oh.
The quote is, Methodists is trying to do their business of saving lives without giving them the COVID virus. It's a choice made to keep staff, patients, and families safer. Bridges can freely choose to accept, that's the employee, to accept or refuse a COVID-19 vaccine. But if she refuses, she'll simply need to work somewhere else.
Yeah. Well, and as you know, Arbeit macht frei. So go to work, I guess.
Valerie Gutmann-Koch, co-director of the University of
German.
Houston's Health and Law and Policy Institute, called the decision another step in demonstrating the legality of these mandates, particularly in a health crisis like this. There isn't much to rely on to argue the mandate should be illegal. But in an era of activist conservative judges, you never know. So it's just an interesting outcome. Well, and why is it important? It's important because we still have a pandemic, folks.
Oh,
there are 7 states with less than 70% of those 65 plus fully vaccinated. Utah's lowest at 60.
Okay. Well,
there's 5 states with less than 40% of the total population getting their first dose. Mississippi at 35, Louisiana 37, Alabama 37, Wyoming 38, Idaho 39, Vermont by contrast is 72, and Connecticut something like 71. So this is from Howard Foreman, who says get vaccinated before Delta dominates, meaning the Delta variant.
Oh, not Delta
it's
House.
More deadly and easier to catch. And along those lines, there's a very interesting, very short tweet thread by Bob Wachter, who is the chair of the UCSF Department of Medicine, who has this to say. And this is in the pundit roundup, but let me copy it for you and give it to you so it's much easier for you to read.
Sure.
And we'll pretend I had done this beforehand.
All done.
For those of you listening at home.
All right, Bob.
So he says, look, I know everybody's sick of playing three-dimensional COVID chess. Sorry, but the Delta variant forces us back to the chessboard. Ergo, this thread. If you are fully vaxxed, I wouldn't be too worried, especially if you're in a highly vaxxed region. That would be me. That would be you.
Okay.
But if you're not vaccinated, I'd be afraid, maybe even very afraid. Why? Let's start with the things we know about the current situation, then layer in new information about the Delta, also known as the Indian variant, B1617.2, for those of you playing at home with a scorecard. Then we'll end with what I'd suggest you do.
Okay.
Current U.S. situation's good. Cases, hospitalizations, and deaths are falling fast, largely due to our fabulous vaccines in San Francisco, with about 70% of people aged more than 12 fully vaccinated. We're nearly in a post-COVID world. Everybody's opening up, including on Tuesday, California. That's tomorrow, and that's fine for now. Sadly, about 50% of the U.S. greater than 12 remains unvaccinated, and in certain states, mostly southern and right-leaning, it's more like two-thirds. We know that a small number of vaccinated people will get breakthrough infections, but they'll rarely get sick and will almost never die. Unvaccinated people remain at high risk if they're exposed to it. In April, I argued in the Washington Post that this is the most dangerous time for unvaccinated people since their bodies are no better at fighting the virus than they were in 2019, and the virus they're likely to see, back then it was the Alpha UK variant, is better at infecting people. But unvaxxed folks have two advantages. They tend to be younger, so less likely to get sick, and they were less likely to be exposed to virus since community rates had fallen. And this remains true, which is why the unvaxxed may go through the summer okay, but fall and winter now scares me a lot, much more than it did 2 weeks ago, and the reason is Delta. From the start, we said the three things to know about variants are A, they're more infectious, B, they can be more serious, that is, are you likely to get sick, and C, are they vaccine resistant? Alpha was 40% more infectious, and there's still debate whether alpha is more serious, but there's no question that vaccines approved in the U.S. work just fine.
Okay.
Even though it became the dominant virus in Israel, the UK, and now the U.S., and here it's about 69% of current cases. Relatively high vaccination rates in these countries prevented it from becoming much of a problem. Why is Delta scarier? First, it appears to be even more infectious than the Alpha variant, probably by a similar amount, by about 40% more than Alpha. And this means the same exposure that a person might have had last year now is about twice as likely to result in an infection. Second, it's looking like it's more serious, that we need more data. And third, and this is the big one, it does appear to be somewhat immune resistant. Before getting too freaked out about this, it's worth noting the data is reassuring in a way. 2 doses of Pfizer is 88%, only a smidge lower than 95, and still great. But the first dose is concerning. That is to say, the thing about the Delta variant is that if you've only had 1 dose of a 2-dose series, you're not that protected. Right? You're about 80% protected for the others, but it's only about 33% protected for the Delta variant.
Okay, so get the second one.
So people stay vulnerable until after shot 2, and many people let their guard down earlier after shot 1.
Oh, yes.
Okay, and there's some degree of vaccine immune escape, and although this isn't proven, I'd worry that a fully vaccinated elder or somebody whose immunity stems from an infection more than a year ago won't be sufficiently protected over time. So what do? For a vaccinated person, watch the Delta percentage in your region. Currently, it's around 6% in the U.S. and rising. And COVID cases in your community. And if you're seeing more cases and more Delta, I'd restore some precautions, at least indoor mask wearing if you stop. By the way, I haven't, he says. And if you're unvaxxed, get your shots. You may be reassured by low local case rate, but don't be. It may be due to summer plus the still low Delta fraction. Both will change. Okay. So also the matter of timing. If your strategy was I'll consider a shot if I see an uptake in cases is also a loser strategy, because once a surge begins, it's too late, and then you need 2 shots, and that takes a full month, and by that time you may be sick or dead.
Oh, yeah. Well,
so that would be a losing strategy if you turn out to be sick or dead. People have already noticed. He goes on to talk about that, about how things that work so well, you get lulled into a false sense of security. But the fact of the matter is that nowadays the people who are winding up in hospitals are the unvaccinated at just about any age.
Well, that makes sense.
Right. So something to keep an eye on, and why it's important to pay attention to that stuff.
Right.
So that's all I'm going to say about that as of today.
Yes. This time the Deltas against the rules. The Deltas win. And the rule. Well, that is to say, because it was by default. Because last time the rules lost, way back when. Okay.
Right. So two more things
changed.
to mention.
Just less entertaining.
Yeah. In terms of the infrastructure struggles in a power sharing Senate.
Oh, infrastructure. Oh no, it's not infrastructure week. Is it? Okay.
It's always infrastructure week.
It's happening. Used to it. It's happening.
It's happening. This is from Politico Playbook.
All right.
Manchin and Sinema still might get their way. Oh. See what happened, and I don't remember how much we talked about it. I think as I was leaving on my last tour of duty on the show last week, yes. We were talking about the group of 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats led by Kristen Sinema.
Well, yes.
Who were putting together a proposal, and I mentioned the reason that group had some juice, even though it didn't have leadership in it.
Juice, okay.
Is because Sinema had worked very hard to build relations with Rob Portman on the Republican side, and Sinema gets along better with McConnell than many other Democrats.
Okay.
Manchin does too. And Manchin's part of the group, but it's really being led by Sinema.
Huh. Well, now we'll maybe figure out what she's about.
Okay. And The View from the West Wing says, Politico today, we ran this by the White House, which has been in close contact with Sinema as she tries to put together this deal, and a source agreed this is indeed a key dynamic to watch this week, which is a two-pronged approach. You scale down the infrastructure part, and then you do the rest by reconciliation later. But that only works if Sinema and Manchin buy into that approach. And it only works if people like Bernie Sanders are convinced that Sinema and Manchin are playing the long game here. Because if they are convinced, Ed Markey you can throw in there too, because he's got issues about how much environmental stuff is going to be in there. Now, Lisa Murkowski said, just don't call it that. You're not going to see a lot of things in this bill that say climate and environment. Call it something else. Doesn't matter what you call it, as long as something is in there. But their point is you can do that later with reconciliation and spare Republicans from having to vote for something that their fossil fuel sponsors simply won't permit them to do. So you pass the smaller bill, and then you pass a reconciliation bill later. And that works if everybody's on board, including Manchin and Sinema within the Democratic caucus. And that's what they're talking about in terms of that strategy. Their view, the White House view, is that a deal would be hard to land but not impossible. The main sticking points, they want more details on the pay-fors, more climate-related spending, and most important, an assurance that Sinema can produce 10 Republican votes.
Yeah.
The 5 Republicans in the Sinema group remain cautiously optimistic they can deliver. During floor votes Thursday, those Republican senators started briefing their colleagues about the proposal, and that effort will ramp up this week. That's why this is Infrastructure Week, by the way.
I see. Okay.
Unlike the previous negotiations that failed, the two sides are at least in the same ballpark when it comes to the size of the package. And how to pay for it remains a struggle. The Senate group has a list of 10 to 12 ideas they're circulating. Some are sweeteners to bring in Republicans, other sweeteners they think Biden might favor, but there's not much overlap. For example, Republicans had some hope that indexing the gas tax to inflation might be a loophole to Biden's pledge not to raise taxes. No dice says the White House. On the other hand, Susan Collins wants to tax electric cars.
Yes, I heard about this.
Which seems on its surface to be crazy. But if you think of it as if a car is on the road, you got to tax the car in order to help pay for the road, it's not that crazy.
Yes, if that's what the gas tax was. And to some extent it was.
And originally it was, or to some extent it was.
Yeah, as a pay for, I mean, it was also supposed to be like, well, should tax gas as a sin tax, basically. But okay, I mean, I get that, but she has a point. There's wear and tear on the roads from an electric car. I can see that. I mean, it was not supposed to be the primary purpose of the gas tax, but
that's what she says. Susan Collins listed 3 papers: an infrastructure financing authority, repurposing unused COVID-19 relief funds, and a provision to ensure that drivers using electric vehicles pay their fair share for using the nation's roads and bridges. which means that their fair share may not be as much as,
maybe
what
it's
a
less.
full
They can only
gas
go
tax
200
would be,
miles.
but at least something. Two other ideas still in the mix per senior GOP aide, various user fee hikes and tax gap enforcement.
Tax gap enforcement?
Yeah, everybody's in favor of that. Millionaires and billionaires don't pay their share.
That
Private
gap.
equity firms
Yes.
don't pay their share. There's trillions there. Go get it. You
Okay.
never get it, but at least it makes it look palatable for when you say, see, it balances.
Yeah, all right.
Hey,
the back
if that's the
end
kind of
these
window
things is
dressing that gets a Republican vote, I'm all for it.
I guess so. Although one of the things that will get their votes is the idea of, well, the Democrats get their part of the bargain later, which usually means, talk to Yair Lapid about that, by the way.
Right.
Are you going to get your turn? Do you get your part of the bargain?
But
well,
nonetheless, even without knowing for sure, because there's no guarantees, he said it's worth it.
Oh, well, then there you go.
One way to think about why this deal is like the triple Lindy of legislating for Biden, to pull it off, the two most conservative Democrats, Manchin and Sinema, need to deliver the most liberal Senator Sanders in their caucus, while the five most anti-Trump Republicans, Portman, Romney, Murkowski, Collins, and Cassidy, need to deliver five of the Trumpy colleagues. Sounds hard, but then again, the triple Lindy was pulled off.
Well, yes, but always by the same guy.
Yeah, well, whatever that means. Rodney Dangerfield.
Yeah.
The most difficult dive of all, the triple Lindy. So he did it,
Yeah, once that we know of on camera.
Right. Just a very interesting thing. It's one of the reasons why I think the idea of keeping your powder dry about Sinema and Manchin was worth it. They're really annoying. But the fact of the matter is, not only do they, in their minds, represent their states, but they're trying something which is a little bit more complicated than just 50 plus one votes. And at the same time, there's a lot of moving parts here. And what happens in the end is a whole lot more important than dumping on Manchin and Sinema, who are never going to be my favorite Democrats. But so what if they get stuff done?
Yeah. I guess so. It just has to happen. That's all. Just a minor sticking point.
And that changes everything, right?
Yeah.
It just has to happen. If it doesn't happen, it all falls apart. If it happens, then okay, there was reason to hold your powder. Speaking of keeping your powder dry, Nancy Pelosi said some interesting things over the weekend on the Sunday shows.
Yeah.
About where to go in terms of investigations, which sounds, of course, very similar to what happened with impeachment. And she said, we'll have a good idea by this week as to what's going on and whether there's any possible way of reconstituting a Senate vote on the January 6th commission. And if not, we have other options. Mm-hmm. And, to me, I heard that and said, okay, she wants to do something and she still doesn't have her caucus completely on board. Or, she's the best vote counter there is, and that means her counting the votes says that she's not quite there yet. Otherwise, she'd have something more concrete to say.
Yes. Well, it was the weekend.
Right. But, this is the week. So it's not only infrastructure week, it's
now.
January 6th week. So we'll see if anything comes out of that.
Well, that's infrastructure, I guess.
Yeah, of a sort.
Sure.
And then finally, a really fascinating piece in the New York Times by Astrid Herndon on your governor.
Mine? Current?
Yeah. Virginia. Because we always like to have a Virginia segment, because we like people in Virginia. Black Virginians took Ralph Northam back. Neither has forgotten. It's basically a very transactional piece about why you give somebody like Ralph Northam another chance. And the answer is because you can get a lot out of it if you do.
Yes.
And it seems like it's an arrangement that's worked well for everybody involved. Very nice piece with lots of quotes. This is when the mayor of Danville, Virginia, who's black, said the developments were a powerful antidote to a society struggling with concepts like cancel culture and wokeness. Instead of derision, Mr. Northam and the black leaders who supported him showed the power of redemption, humility, and growth. Black people have always had to believe in forgiveness and understanding, and I know a lot of times people want to argue it hasn't gotten us anywhere, but I tend to disagree. And got some great quotes out of Northam. I made it very clear from when this happened that racial equity was going to be a top priority for the remainder of our administration, citing the elimination of the death penalty as an example. And it goes on to say, what this experience has done for me is that it's really opened my eyes and talks about and interviews with black activists who were very pained by the whole thing, but felt like this is something that they could get something done, which is just so unusual. And so here's a good example of how you come together at times of crisis when painful things happen, just like any family, and move forward. So it's a very different feeling than just watching Trump and Trumpy people screw up the Department of Justice and figure there's no way forward. Sometimes there is.
All right. Well, I'll be on the lookout for it.
And I'll leave you with that.
Okay.
So, a little smorgasbord of things that happened over the weekend, all interesting stories, I think, in their own right. By the way, there is the very, very first nonpartisan poll out on Virginia politics, which came out over the weekend. I have that in the pundit roundup. But Virginia Governor McAuliffe is up by 4.
All
Lieutenant Governor Ayala's up by 6, the Democrat.
Okay, good.
Virginia Attorney General Herring's up by 7.
Okay.
And the House of Delegates, the Democrats are up by 1.
All right. Well, there's a bunch of them.
Yeah, but, close race.
Okay. So it's only June. But okay. All right. We vote later.
Well, I would rather be ahead than behind.
Yes.
Again, polls aren't predictive, but they give you an idea of where things are.
Although we should just be done. Please. Look,
right.
we're leading.
The last time we had this
Stop
discussion,
the count.
remember, everybody was saying that Gillespie was catching up and he was going to beat Northam, and forget the polls, don't believe the polls, because Gillespie's going to win because caravans, and none of that happened.
That's true.
In fact, Northam outperformed the polls and did better.
Good. All right. I'm ready to get this done already. Let's just go right to it. Let's have early voting, like in June.
Yeah, I suppose. Anyway, that's it for me for today.
Always
I hope you enjoy the rest of your show. I hope you have a lovely show.
I hope I have a show. I will go and find out. I'm sure after the break, I'll take a look around, see what we have.
Well, I did my best to get you to the break.
Yeah, right. Oh,
long-time listeners may remember this was meant to be a half-hour segment, which, reminds me of the, Douglas Adams 5-book trilogies he used to write.
Yeah, well, we couldn't. You can't fit all this stuff. You come here with very wide-ranging roundups, and it's a good thing. And also now we have the distraction of an additional country to cover, at least for the time being. Takes us some time.
Just for a little while. I mean, I think the major drama's over there for now.
I think.
Although I guess this week, remember, for those of you listening last week, there may be another Israeli Flag Day parade, so we'll have to see how that goes.
Oh, right. I guess at the beginning of check the moon. Anytime the moon comes back, I guess.
Yeah, something along those lines. Anyway, take care, and I'll be back on Wednesday, and we'll see what happened between now and then. Oh, Wednesday's going to be the Biden-Putin. I don't think it's fair to call it a love fest. I think it'll be handled a little differently than, say, the North Korea summits. Oh, okay. And I think this time
Helsinki too.
They're taking notes.
Oh, yeah? All right.
And keeping them.
All right. I know. He's missing out on a delicious snack. Biden is. All right. Always eat the notes. We forgot about that. There was the Helsinki notes that were confiscated, but then there was also that Trump was tearing things up in the White House in the Oval Office, but then he ate one of the things, and we really put that aside. I mean, one of our exercises in constantly normalizing the guy. He ate the notes from one of these meetings, and we just went on like, go ahead, be president for another 3 years, and he did.
And he did.
That's crazy.
Alrighty, take care. I'll talk to you.
Very good. Thanks very much, Greg. See you on Wednesday. And let's see, what's up with the rest of the news? Well, we only have a few minutes before taking our next break, but I have this update from the very top of the show when we were worrying about have we forgotten any mass shootings that we should have announced that we were under a cloud from? And I figured that the answer was yes, because it's always true. Technically speaking, I think somewhere along the line the FBI decided that things would be considered mass shootings if there were at least 4 victims in the shooting, and they don't have to be killed. They can be merely wounded, and sometimes this is a subject of some controversy. whether or not the numbers are right. Perhaps if 4 people were wounded, but one of them was wounded with shrapnel, whereas the other one was actually hit with a bullet, well, the shrapnel wouldn't have been there but for the bullet being fired, so they count them. But, when you argue with gun enthusiasts, they tend to go back and forth over any hair that they can split. But anyway, the real point is, with a number like 4, we might have to update that number. I don't know if it's a good idea because it might de-emphasize the level of our epidemic of gun violence in this country. But what it really means is, what it's really indicative of is the explosive growth in gun ownership and the lethality of these guns and the ease with which they can be fired rapidly. So the actual news is, as Igor Volsky informs us, tangentially, I guess, there were 9 incidents with 4 or more victims on Friday evening, from Friday evening through Sunday, I guess, our Weekend USA, as I often hashtag it, in which together left 11 people dead and 50 others injured. Gun safety, he goes on to say, cannot be a priority in name only. And then a hashtag, the time is now. I'm not even aware of this hashtag. The time is now to find a pathway for passing life-saving investment and legislation in the Senate. Okay. Along with a list of some ideas about what those shootings were about and where they were. And I think we can perhaps squeak those in as we get ready to take our top of the hour break. Hang on for our music. Cue. There we go. The 9 incidents include one in Austin, Texas. And Austin apparently had a total of 14 people shot when gunmen fired into a crowd on a popular strip around 1:30 a.m. Saturday. A tourist from New York killed in that incident. In Chicago, 9 people injured and 1 died after 2 men fired on a group of people in the Chatham neighborhood on Saturday. And Savannah, Georgia, the 3rd one on the list. Does anybody really need the details? All sad. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. On our way out there, reading through the list of mass shootings that Igor Volsky had put together, including the 3 from Austin, Texas, Chicago, and Savannah. I haven't checked into any of these, and they are linked here, and I wanted to take a look. But, what's interesting, as we were running out of time, and I said, well, does anybody really need the details of the Savannah shooting? There are details, and what I really meant was I'm running out of time to actually give them to you before the break. But 7 people injured, 1 died, and the note here is that this was in the 2nd shooting at the same apartment complex within the same week. So that leads me, I guess, to the next point. You've probably felt it or guessed it, but what the big difference between the fact that every weekend brings multiple mass shootings with it, because the number is low, because here, well, ostensibly in America, we value people's lives, but we really don't. And to have 4 people shot and have their lives imperiled is a shocking thing. And I guess that's enough for, I don't know why they set the number at 4. But these days, the weapons that people are able to get off the shelves and carry around with them, sometimes openly, sometimes not, you don't need an AR-15 to be able to shoot a whole bunch of people more or less indiscriminately at the drop of a hat, or even with your hat still securely double-sided stick taped to your bald spot, whatever. It doesn't require anything. Off-the-shelf handguns can fire very rapidly into a crowd, and in fact, a point we've made before in the past, not very many people do this, but yes, you can bump fire a handgun just like you can bump fire a semi-automatic rifle. It's a little bit more difficult, but you can do it with or without equipment. They don't generally sell a whole lot of bump stock, pre-made bump stock items for handguns, but people rig them up, and they can do it you can do it with your bare hands, you can do it with a piece of wood, a stick, whatever. But of course, for AR-15s, it's all about accessorizing, and so they actually have the bump stocks. By the way, I don't know if I ever mentioned on the show, but I mentioned on Twitter a couple of days ago when we were talking about this stuff. You may recall that the bump stock ban was the one thing that Donald Trump was able to make out of the incredibly horrific Las Vegas shooting, however many years ago, and I think we're coming up on, I think we just had one of these, right, the anniversary of it, and it was, what are we, 4 years, 5 years from it? I don't know. I can't remember anymore. But you may recall that one. And the fact that people, I mean, everyone recalls it when you say, oh, yeah, the Las Vegas shooting. Oh, yeah. But it doesn't always spring to mind. People don't always think a great deal about it, which is incredible all by itself because almost 600 people were shot in that incident. And I mean, if 600 people had died from, or not, they didn't all die, obviously, but if 600 people had contracted COVID at a mass event somewhere, we would never have forgotten it. But 600 people instead shot in the streets of Las Vegas, and 50-something people, I think 58 people, and then later on 2 additional people died, I think. So it's like 60 people died in that shooting. And, you know, and still basically nothing came out of it. And to no one's surprise, given the other infamous mass shootings from which nothing really has come on the federal level. States have sometimes reacted better. But anyway, you might recall that Trump was able to bring himself around to saying, well, we should very strongly take a look at getting rid of these bump stock thing, you know, because everyone was shocked that you could turn an AR-15 into a machine gun with an aftermarket part. And that's because, you know, most of us don't pay attention to such things. Why should you? But that you can buy things that can function as machine guns off the shelf, and you can buy dozens of them, and there's no limit on it. And then you can hole yourself up in a Las Vegas Strip hotel and gun people down from the windows, and there's not much anybody can do about it. But at least he managed to get that thing done. And the ATF, BATF, as they sometimes now call it, were successful they successfully implemented a bump stock ban, but apparently it only lasted a little while. And very recently, I think May of this year, a conservative appeals court somewhere struck down the ban or put a stay on the ban, even if they didn't actually strike it down in its entirety. For various reasons, and I never really got into the reasoning that the court used. But, by the way, just in case you were wondering about that one so-called success that the Trump administration, the one thing that dotard president was able to get done simply by decreeing it to be the case, was undone very recently. And I guess, I don't know whether that really affected the market for bump stocks or not. I'm not in it, so I don't know. But I just thought I would bring that to your attention somewhere. I'll have to make a note to myself to find that reference. It's somewhere among my own tweets, so I'll be able to pull that out with a brief search. But that wasn't where I was going when I was coming back from the break. What I was going to say was, one, that every weekend these things happen, and that's largely because these weapons can be, you know, your basic handgun. If you buy a new handgun, a semi-automatic pistol, you can fire into a crowd very easily and shoot more than 4 people, and of course it does happen, just pretty much wherever these guns turn up. But why some mass shootings or some weekends worth of mass shootings capture our national attention and why others don't, I suspect, I've never really tracked it, but I'm guessing that you could track it and find that basically these other mass shootings get dismissed probably because of who's doing the shooting and who's being hit. In other words, as you may have guessed, you know, on your own before I ever brought this up, when a lot of white people get shot, that's a mass shooting. And, you know, the sort of mass shooting that gets people's attention or gets news organizations' attention. And everybody has a national tragedy, and we want the flag lowered to half-staff, and all quite properly that we would mourn people's deaths. But, you know, there's mass shootings all over the place, and you wonder why we become, you know, numb to it all. But part of it is because, honestly, I think it's partly because they say, well, you know, these are club shootings. These are people on the streets outside of a nightclub at 1:30 in the morning, and guess what we think that means? And I'm kind of guessing, I'm betting that if a bunch of minority people get shot, that's just people going crazy. Especially if they can say, well, 4 people got shot and nobody died, they all were shot. But that doesn't even count. Not, and then of course those people would say, well, not because they're, whatever their color may be, black, brown, you pick it, but because, well, they didn't die. Well, suppose they did all die. We still don't have any national reaction to it. I'm guessing that, and that sometimes has something to do with it. Middle of the evening, a bunch of white people in Las Vegas get shot, like a bunch, 600 from the hotel room. Well, 14 people were shot here in Austin. Like, what? Come on. Oh, I see. A gunman fired into a crowd on a popular strip outside of the nightclubs at 1:30 in the morning on Saturday. Okay. But I bet if you look into it, I bet they are victims of color and a shooter of color as well. And we just go, ugh, that's just Saturday night in Austin, Saturday night in Chicago, Saturday night in Savannah. And the second shooting at the same apartment complex. I wonder what that apartment complex is like. Well, yeah, and I mean, on the one hand, it's like, well, it's actually, what do we say, racially tinged. That's the way we conduct calling anybody racist, right? Racially tinged to bring this up, but on the other hand, this is actually important. We ought to be wondering aloud why we don't pay attention to mass shootings if they take place outside of nightclubs. It's not nightclubs that are making us not pay attention. Pulse was a nightclub. We all paid attention to that one. And, and there were plenty of minority patrons as well who were there and were victims. But that nightclub shooting we pay attention to. 14 people just shot in a nightclub in Austin, Texas. And I guess, I don't know. I had to lean on Igor Volsky to tell me that was the case. I would have to take a look around for these things are not linked because he's put a picture of the roundup in here, and to get the details we'd have to go and search them out. But it's worthwhile as a research project one day. We really ought to be asking ourselves the question of why more of us don't know about these, and we get the sense that there's lots of shootings, but we don't talk about it enough. Okay. I want to move on from that. A couple other stories, totally different directions to go in, and one is, well, it's an update on a story you've likely heard about, but I don't know if we ever got around to reporting it. It's definitely in my pocket folder somewhere. But now we have a resolution to the story, so that's a more interesting place to start. The story of Oregon State Representative Mike Neerman, whose name may not ring a bell, but is the guy whose actions will ring a bell. The guy who was made a video of himself prior to the January 6th insurrections. And remember that there were plans on, at the time, in January, for the rallies, riots, and insurrections to take place, to be mirrored at state legislatures across the country. And by the way, I think if there had been more of those going on, we might really have had a somewhat different outcome of things. Their plan was, well, if we take over not only the Capitol in Washington, but the Capitol buildings in all the state capitals as well, like this might actually be recognized as the coup we were hoping for. And, well, they attempted it. In some states, they actually breached the Capitol. And in Oregon, they became one of those states. And the story was that we saw on video this guy, Mike Neerman, basically briefing conservative activists ahead of time saying, I will be there. I will open the door for you and let you come in. And I think he actually, like an idiot, gave it a code name of Operation Hall Pass. Anyway, here is the reporting in one of the local outlets, the pronunciation of which I now remember from previous run-ins with it and your help, all of you who told me how to pronounce Willamette week, even though it looks like Willamette, like a diminutive William or something like that. But it's Willamette somehow, because I guess we're English speakers. And good, I'm glad I remembered that. Oregon House expels Representative Mike Neerman. That's the correct answer in dealing with this guy. He is the one who allowed armed protesters to breach the state capitol. The subheader here, these guys use subheaders for the proper purpose. Video of Neerman plotting Operation Hall Pass with far-right figures eroded any will from the House Republican caucus. They call it a caucus there instead of a conference? Interesting. To protect him. So, interesting angle on the whole thing. Like, they otherwise probably would have tried to cast doubt on it and keep him in his seat, but the video was enough to convince them, which is a fantastic parallel to all sorts of things. Chiefly, I think, obviously, you probably had the same thought as I do, videoing police actions, particularly when they are making stops with people of color in their target sites. And how many people in America, well, lots of people in America still don't believe in this stuff for whatever reason, this stuff being systemic racism and police brutality. But there are, of course, others who probably had doubts or said, well, maybe you did something that I don't understand. And there's still people who say, oh, what happened before the video? But now at least more people are seeing videos and saying, all right, I can't deny this. Well, here they couldn't deny this either. Aaron Mesh and Justin Yao are on the byline in Willamette Week, reporting this story. For the first time in its history, the Oregon legislature has voted to expel a sitting member, State Representative Mike Neerman, a Republican who I guess counts as his hometown, Independence, Oregon. So I don't know whether that's really the name of his hometown, or I have my doubts. He may live on the outskirts of a nearby town, but likes to claim Independence as his hometown. Anyway, he used his independence to coordinate with armed extremists to allow them inside the state capitol last, December. It was even before 1/6. How interesting. On Thursday evening, the Oregon House voted 59-1 to expel Neerman, the only dissenting vote, obviously, Neerman himself. They do let you vote in that. The facts are clear that Mr. Neerman unapologetically coordinated and planned a breach of the Oregon State Capitol. House Speaker Tina Kotek said Thursday in a statement, his actions were blatant and deliberate, and he has shown no remorse for jeopardizing the safety of every person in the Capitol that day. Given the extraordinary circumstances, this was the only reasonable path forward. Earlier this month, Oregon Public Broadcasting and other media outlets obtained a video that showed Neerman had coordinated days in advance to allow gun-toting protesters into the Capitol building while lawmakers were inside. That video of Neerman plotting Operation Hall Pass with other far-right figures eroded any will from the House Republican caucus to protect him. On Monday, his colleagues in the GOP sent him a letter asking him to resign. He refused. On Thursday, as the special committee debated his expulsion, Neerman argued that state lawmakers had violated the state constitution by closing the building to the public to prevent the spread of COVID-19. They never should have excluded the public from the public's building, he said. It's something to talk about, but the guns, you see. All right. Armed conservative protesters had repeatedly gathered outside the Capitol in 2020, seething at COVID-19 lockdowns of restaurants and other businesses, but the gravity of Neerman's action only became clear after January 6th, when loyalists to President Donald Trump surged into the U.S. Capitol in a failed insurrection. How interesting that dynamic is. On Thursday evening, a small crowd of Neerman's supporters gathered at a side door of the Capitol and watched a live broadcast on a flat-screen television as 59 Oregon representatives voted to expel him. Any meeting or session of the governing body is supposed to be open to the public, one protest leader told the crowd, consisting of about 40 people. Everybody who votes to keep this building closed is breaking the law. The small crowd huddled around the small tent that sheltered the television. Not you. I'm sheltering the television. As the live broadcast started. As the expulsion hearing began, many chanted, Traitors, 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 at the Capitol building and the television screen, both, they were chanting at both of them, as different representatives stood on the Capitol floor and offered testimony. After the session ended, the small crowd moved to the back of the Capitol building on Court Street, hoping to meet with Neerman himself. Instead, most verbally accosted legislators who had voted for Neerman's expulsion. The crowd split in two, targeting both exits of the Capitol building parking structure. Traitors, traitors, this time just two. The crowd yelled at state legislators as they exited their building in their vehicles. The Western States Center, a pro-democracy, thankfully, nonprofit that watchdogs extremist groups and has demanded Neerman's resignation for months, said Thursday's vote drew an important line in the sand. Oregonians were able to watch as Neerman, caught on security tape, helped violent extremists, including some who were armed, bypass security and enter the locked Capitol building, where they scuffled with law enforcement and threatened legislators and staff, Executive Director Eric Ward wrote. It was clear to us then that he must be removed, but it wasn't clear whether partisan politics would allow it, Ward said. We applaud legislators for overcoming partisan and personal differences to take a firm stand today against extremism. It's nice. It's the right answer. It's quite something that it took actually catching him on video, not only preparing for and planning this operation, but also security video of him executing the operation. That is to say, opening the doors, the locked side doors through which he let the armed protesters in. And I guess that was enough that they couldn't deny the propriety of the expulsion. And I don't know what. I mean, I guess they could have, but they refused to do it. They looked like idiots doing it, and no one could bring themselves to do it except Neerman himself, I guess, to no one's surprise. So that's interesting, and that's a good update to things. Let me get around to the story which I mentioned at the beginning of the show, the subpoenas to both, we mentioned, I guess, at the end of last week, the subpoenas to members and staffers and family members over at the House Intelligence Committee and how that's expanded. Over the weekend, the New York Times reported through Mike Schmidt and Charlie Savage, two, pretty active reporters in this front. For when it comes to surveillance, Charlie Savage, I think, pretty much unparalleled in the mainstream media about that. Mike Schmidt hasn't had a surveillance focus, but has been Trump focused the whole time. But anyway, two big names, I think, on this thing. Apple, this headline says, is said to have turned over data on Trump's White House counsel in 2018. I don't know whether this headline changed along the way, but rereading it in light of pushback that the story has gotten, I can see, they're treading a little more lightly. I mean, there's no mention of subpoena here in this headline. The company notified Donald F. McGahn II, that's his full name, by the way, last month that it had been subpoenaed, there's the mention, for his account information 3 years ago. And I guess they're just getting around to it now. So let's see. We'll read through it and get the details. Mentioning again, I don't think we're going to have time for parsing through the pushback, just because it's been very difficult to follow along. But I have a different source on secondary analysis, and it's everyone's Twitter pal NYC Southpaw, who follows these things pretty closely and parses these things pretty well. I thought we'd take a look at this, but just at least a couple notes from Schmidt and Savage on this. The Justice Department they did subpoena Apple for information in February of 2018 about an account that belonged to Don McGahn, Trump's White House counsel at the time, and barred the company from telling him about it. According to two people briefed in the matter, Apple told McGahn about the subpoena last month, said one of these people, who spoke on condition of anonymity because blah, blah, blah. And McGann's wife also received a similar notice from Apple, the person said. Not that she was subpoenaed or that her records were subpoenaed, but she got notice from Apple, which I guess means that her records were turned over at some point. And this is one of the big things about parsing these stories and these statements, is it makes a difference who got notice of a subpoena, who got notice of the fact that their records may have been turned over to somebody even though they weren't the target of a subpoena, etc., etc. It's not clear what FBI agents were investigating, whether McGann was their specific focus or whether he was swept up in a larger net because he had communicated with someone who was under scrutiny. And that's key too. As the top lawyer for the 2016 Trump campaign and then the White House counsel, McGann was in contact with numerous people who may have drawn attention either as part of the Russia investigation or a later leak inquiry. Still, the disclosure that agents had collected data on a sitting White House counsel, which they kept secret for years, is extraordinary. And it comes amid a political backlash after revelations that the Trump administration secretly seized the personal data of reporters and Democrats in Congress from phone and tech companies while investigating leaks. So it's not clear that there's any relationship between this seizure of records and the ones we discussed last week. But it is, there's some remarkable similarities, that's for sure. Democratic leaders on Capitol Hill on Sunday ratcheted up the pressure on the Justice Department and former officials to provide a fuller accounting of events. They called on the head of the Justice Department's National Security Division, John C. Demers, and the former Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, to testify before Congress, along with former Attorneys General Jeff Sessions and Bill Barr. A Justice Department spokesman declined to comment, as did a lawyer for McGann. An Apple representative also did the same. Just didn't respond. If you really want to parse things, it's different. Apple told McGann that it had complied with the subpoena in a timely fashion, but declined to tell him what it had provided the government, according to a person briefed on the matter. Under Justice Department policy, gag orders for subpoenas may be renewed for up to a year at a time, suggesting that prosecutors went to court several times to prevent Apple from notifying the McGanns earlier. In investigations, agents sometimes compile a large list of phone numbers and email addresses that were in contact with the subject and seek to identify all those people by using subpoenas to communications companies for any account information like names, computer addresses, and credit card numbers associated with them. Apple told the McGanns that it had received the subpoena on February 23, 2018. Under federal law, prosecutors generally need to obtain permission from a federal judge in order to compel a company like Apple to delay notifying people that their personal information has been subpoenaed, said Paul Rosen, former federal prosecutor and partner now at Crowell and Mooring. I don't know why I advertise for them, but anyway, there's a lot we don't know here, including the facts and circumstances surrounding the request for the delay and what was presented to the judge, Rosen said. But he added, prosecutors typically need to prove that either notifying the person would endanger someone's safety, risk the destruction of evidence, or intimidation of witnesses, or seriously jeopardize an investigation. The subpoena was issued by a grand jury in the Eastern District of Virginia. The other person familiar with the matter said, it's not clear why prosecutors obtained the subpoena, but several notable developments were unfolding around that time. The federal court in the Eastern District of Virginia was the center of one part of the Russia inquiry, led by the special counsel, Robert Mueller, that focused on Paul Manafort, a former chair of the 2016 Trump campaign. Well, you know who he is. Because McGann had been the top lawyer for the Trump campaign in 2016, it is possible that at some earlier point he had been among those in contact with someone whose account the Mueller team was scrutinizing in early 2018. Notably, Mr. Manafort had been hit with new fraud charges unsealed in the Eastern District of Virginia the day before the subpoena. Subsequent developments revealed that Mueller's investigators were closely scrutinizing some of his communications accounts in the following days. So that's the speculation of how this might have ended up these records might have ended up in FBI hands without there necessarily having been any real suspicion of Don McGahn doing anything in particular. They may just have been saying, well, we're checking out what Manafort is doing, and if Manafort made a call to Don McGahn, we want to know about it. And if Don McGahn made some calls immediately afterwards, we might be interested in finding out who they called. And they may have looked and found nothing. Yeah, he tried to call Don McGahn, and McGahn said, get the hell out of here, Manafort. I don't want to talk to you. That could have been the answer. So, anyway, we'll explore this a little more after this. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning. I have good news to report. Many more listeners like you are making critical contributions that keep our show on the air. Makes good sense, of course, and patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple. Now you can make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. Maybe you'd like to thank us for helping keep you sane during the Trump era. Maybe you're looking forward to in-depth explanations of what's going on in the Biden administration. Whatever it is that keeps you listening, we need your help to keep bringing it to you. And hey, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running with those options too. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We literally could not do this without you. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. I think we continue on with the New York Times piece by way of background, and then perhaps we go on to Southpaw's analysis, if only because it's probably more compact and digestible than Marcy's analysis. But just all of this should be absorbed carefully and parsed along the way to be sure that we know what they are saying versus what we're supposed to infer on our own from the way it's been saying and the way the story has been structured here. I don't think they're trying to mislead anybody, but they're certainly trying to make it more interesting and start wondering about what was going on here. All right, so the last bit was that Manafort had just been hit with new fraud charges unsealed in the Eastern District of Virginia the day before the same district's grand jury issued the subpoena that brought in McGahn. Right, and we described one reason why that might have netted McGahn, even if it wasn't a specific target. They might have said, we want to know everybody that Manafort made calls to as soon as he knew that he was being charged. And then see if he's making, a call to networks of people that he might be able to use to manipulate the case, or something like that. And if so, then we follow up on that and figure out who they're talking to, and then begin to see if it's an obvious enough pattern for us. Can we demonstrate to a judge that we want the content of those calls as well, or start gathering the content of his calls? So the article continues. On the other hand, the Manafort case was largely handled in the District of Columbia, although this did happen. There were new fraud charges in Eastern District of Virginia, but the bulk of the Manafort case was in D.C., where he faced separate charges. Still, the Mueller team was also working with federal prosecutors in Virginia during that period on an unregistered foreign agent case related to Turkey and a business partner of Mike Flynn's, Trump's former national security advisor, of course, and notorious spy. It was around this time that McGahn was involved in another matter related to the Russia investigation, one that included a leak. In late January 2018, the New York Times reported, based on confidential sourcing, that Mr. Trump had ordered McGahn the previous June to have the Justice Department remove Mueller, but McGahn had refused to do so and threatened to resign. The Washington Post confirmed that account soon after in a follow-up article, and we learned all about that, I think, in the Mueller report as well. The Mueller report and Mr. McGahn, in private testimony before the House Judiciary Committee this month, described Trump's anger at McGahn after the Times article and how he had tried to persuade McGahn to make a statement falsely denying it. Trump told aides that McGahn was a, quote, liar and a, quote, leaker. According to former Trump administration officials, in his testimony, McGahn said that he had been a source for the Post's follow-up to clarify a nuance. That is, to whom he had conveyed his intentions to resign, but he had not been a source for the original Times article. There are reasons to doubt that McGahn was the target of any Justice Department leak investigation stemming from that episode, however. Information about Trump's orders to dismiss Mueller, for example, would not appear to be a classified national security secret of the sort that it can be a crime to disclose. Yet another roughly concurrent event was a Justice Department investigation into unauthorized disclosures of information about the Russia inquiry. As part of that investigation, prosecutors sent Apple a subpoena on February 6, 2018, for data on congressional staff members, their families, and at least 2 members of Congress. Apple only recently informed those targets because it had been prohibited from disclosing the subpoena at the time. Among those whose data were seized were 2 Democrats on the House Intelligence Committee, Swalwell and Schiff, right? Both of California. Schiff, a sharp political adversary, or do you like to say adversary, of Mr. Trump, is now the panel's chairman. The Times first reported on that subpoena last week. Many questions remain unanswered about the events leading up to the subpoenas, including how high they were authorized in the Trump Justice Department and whether investigators anticipated or hoped that they were going to sweep in data on the politically prominent lawmakers. The subpoena sought data on 109 email addresses and phone numbers. In that case, the leak investigation appeared to have been primarily focused on Michael Behar, then a staff member of the House Intelligence Committee. People close to Sessions and Rosenstein, the 2 top Justice Department officials at the time, have said that neither knew that prosecutors had sought data about the accounts of lawmakers for that investigation. It remains unclear whether agents were pursuing a theory that Behar had leaked on his own, or whether they suspected him of talking to reporters with the approval of lawmakers. Either way, it appears they were unable to prove their suspicions that he was the source of any unauthorized disclosures. The case has been closed and no charges were brought. Speaker Pelosi on Sunday called for Barr, Sessions, and Rosenstein to testify before Congress about the subpoenas. She said that what the Justice Department did under Trump went, quote, even beyond Richard Nixon, but declined to say whether a congressional committee would compel their testimony, which would be only at least as far as Richard Nixon, let's say. Let's hope they will want to honor the rule of law. Well, that's not likely. The Justice Department has been rogue under President Trump. Chuck Schumer, majority leader in the Senate, of course, called for anyone potentially involved in the subpoenas, including Mr. Demers, to testify before Congress. The sins of the Trump administration just continue to pile up, he said at a news conference in New York. This was nothing less than a gross abuse of power and assault on the separation of powers, Schumer said, warning that if the men who would not testify, lawmakers would subpoena them. But we know where that goes. He also called on Senate Republicans to join Democrats in voting for congressional subpoenas to compel testimony. On CBS, Senator Susan Collins called the allegations serious, very serious, but said only that she was backing an investigation into the matter by the Justice Department's own Inspector General that was announced on Friday. So, okay, that's not likely to go too far, but now it's just a bunch of calls for investigation. I'm not too excited necessarily, but the prospects of finding all that out. Although, McGahn's story has always been interesting, even from back in the Mueller report. It seemed like he was an interesting guy and revealed more than I thought he was going to in his interviews. All right, let me take a quick look over at what Lupe Lupin has said. That's better known to us, of course, as NYC Southpaw on Twitter, writing in, I guess it's not a Substack thing, but a newsletter format called Paw Prints. But actually this time parsing something else that we've been wondering about over the last couple of days. I don't know, for some reason I mistook this in my head as a parsing of the value, the news value of the McGahn angle in this story. But I guess it is just Marcy talking about it. So maybe Southpaw's been talking about it and I didn't grab that. But this is actually a parsing of the reading of the Park Police Inspector General report over the Lafayette Square incident, which is still, weighing heavily in all of our minds. But let me see. Does this make sense to shift gears to, or perhaps read alongside something else? Perhaps then it's best saved for a different day, and we look into something else instead. Yeah, all right. Well, I don't know. I'm a little bit anxious to read that, but also anxious to read into a couple of other things too. Why don't I... Well, we'll skim through it and see what Southpaw has to say, because we'll be back on this subject soon enough, I'm sure. Reading the Park Police IG report more closely. Dear readers, it begins, last summer amid a nationwide explosion of angry protest following the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police, the area around the White House witnessed several nights of violence. Did it? Witnessed several nights of protest, but okay. Unlikely to just simply flatly assert that there was violence unless there was something going on too, but it was low level. But a lot of times the violence was, well, that's true. It's left open here whether the violence was police violence or not, so I suppose it's entirely possible that on balance it's a good call. Let's see. Continuing on. On Friday, May 29th, 2020, and continuing into the early morning hours of May 30th, the confrontations between protesters and police were especially pitched, and the chaos verged uncomfortably close to the White House. The Secret Service reportedly rushed President Trump into the underground bunker in response to the threat, prompting widespread mockery. I remember that, and I remember taking part in it. And I remembered again that it happened when, just for kicks, on January 6th, we noted that the Secret Service reportedly rushed Vice President Pence, as well as Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, third in the line of succession to the presidency, and Senate President Pro Tem, which I guess at that point was Pat Leahy, also into protective custody, I guess you could say. I don't think they went to an underground bunker, but they certainly went to undisclosed locations under threat of death from the crowd. And for some reason, when there was protest outside the White House in late May and early June of 2020, the president was ushered into an underground bunker. But during an actual insurrection, for some strange reason, the president didn't take any additional security precautions whatsoever, according to the White House pool reports of the time. But there we go. Just wanted to bring that up again. Never going to miss a chance to do that. Anyway, the next two weekend nights, the security perimeter around the White House expanded northward across Lafayette Park, which sits across a pedestrian thoroughfare from the North Lawn. D.C. officials imposed a curfew, and violence around the Capitol escalated. Or that is to say, the Capitol, lowercase c, capital A-L. That is the capital city. Violence around the city escalated as city police and a surreal array of federal forces, some without any clear indicia of the agencies they belong to, you remember that, locked horns with the crowds. In the weekend upheaval, the historic St. John's Church on the north end of the park briefly caught fire. By that Monday, the D.C. curfew had been moved up to 7 p.m. My colleague, Hunter Walker, arrived in the vicinity of the White House before that time, thinking that he'd at least have an hour to set up before the nightly clashes between police and protesters erupted. It was not to be. The video he captured shows the violent expulsion of protesters, press, and clergy from the area that began within minutes, led by officers mounted on horseback. And here's the video embedded as promised. Almost immediately after the violent expulsion, former President Trump emerged from the White House and walked across Lafayette Square through a phalanx of law enforcement officers in riot gear to pose for photos in front of the boarded-up church. Many observers, looking at the proximity of the photo op to the expulsion and a convincing circumstantial case examining then Attorney General Bill Barr's appearance at the protest scene before the expulsion began, concluded that the expulsion had been ordered and timed to allow for Trump's photo op at the church. Yesterday, the Inspector General and this was last week, of course, the Inspector General for the Department of Interior released a report on the U.S. Park Police's involvement in the expulsion that was widely taken to knock down that conclusion. The IG's executive summary says it was really all about installing a security fence. And here, the quote from the report: "The evidence we obtained did not support a finding that the U.S. Park Police cleared the park to allow the president to survey the damage and walk to St. John's Church. Instead, the evidence we reviewed showed us that the U.S. Park Police cleared the park to allow a Secret Service contractor to safely install the anti-scale fencing in response to destruction of property and injury to officers occurring on May 30th and 31st. Further, the evidence showed that the USPP did not know about the president's potential movement until mid to late afternoon on June 1st, hours after it had begun developing its operational plan and the fencing contractor had arrived at the park. Most media outlets built their headlines around this conclusion. That is to say, CBS reporting right away: Watchdog finds clearing of protesters from Lafayette Park wasn't for Trump photo op. ABC, we read last week, police did not clear Lafayette Square so Trump could hold Bible photo op, says a Watchdog. And then CNN, Watchdog reports finds Park Police did not clear racial injustice protesters from Lafayette Park for Trump's visit to St. John's Church last June. The problem with these headlines is the actual IG report is too jurisdictionally limited to support those conclusions and offers multiple reasons to doubt its exonerative conclusion. Showing off a little bit there, Southpaw. Indeed, if you click through, you'll find each of the news stories linked above is more equivocal than its headline. The oversimplification of the report in these headlines and in TV coverage has led to widespread confusion about its contents. Here are a few important points to know about what the IG report actually says and doesn't say. So we have a somewhat less egregious example of the Bill Barr executive summary thing going on here. The conclusion they wanted was stuck up front, and the easy and facile answer in dealing with this at the news agencies was to say, this is the headline they gave us, and we're going to run with it. And if we stick around and read the thing first and understand it before we write our story, we'll be scooped, you see. All right, so here's a few important points about what the report does and doesn't say. First, jurisdictional limitations. We're getting real nuanced here today. It's a good way to end the show, I guess. The IG report only concerns itself with the activities and decision-making of one federal agency, the Park Police, out of many who were present at Lafayette Park on June 1st, 2020. And here, I guess, a clip from the report. As noted above, we focus on the USPP's conduct. So we sought interviews and information from individuals outside of the USPP. When doing so, would provide us with information about USPP's activities. Accordingly, we did not seek to interview Attorney General William Barr, White House personnel, Federal Bureau of Prisons officers, Metropolitan Police Department personnel, or Secret Service personnel regarding their independent decisions that did not involve the U.S. Park Police. We note, however, that the U.S. Department of Justice, Office of Inspector General, and it goes on. The clip must be a photo screenshot. So the beginning of that next sentence doesn't go anywhere. It cuts off at that point. But the important part is basically they're saying, look, this is about the Park Police. So we didn't talk to the Attorney General, other White House people, the Bureau of Prisons officers, any of the other officers that were there, except insofar as we had questions about what the Park Police were doing. This, if it's exonerative at all, it's exonerative or can be exonerative only of the Park Police role in all of this. And it may not even be that. This report does not address all the conduct of law enforcement at Lafayette Park on June 1st. The investigators didn't look into any independent decisions that did not involve the U.S. Park Police. Consequently, when the report speaks about the Park Police's knowledge or how the actions of the Attorney General did or didn't affect the Park Police, those findings can't be extrapolated to all the federal forces present in the park. This limitation exists because the report comes to us from the Department of the Interior's Inspector General, which only has jurisdiction over agencies within the cabinet department, including the Park Police. Other law enforcement agencies on the scene report up to their other bosses, their own bosses. The Bureau of Prisons and the Secret Service are agencies within other cabinet departments, the Department of Justice and Homeland Security, respectively. Importantly, thanks to a report from the Project on Government Oversight, we know that Homeland Security quashed an investigation by its own Inspector General into the Secret Service's part in the events of June 1st. Secondly, the Secret Service's request and key redactions come into play here. Despite its jurisdictional limits, the IG report documents a number of potentially significant interactions that the Park Police had with other agencies, in particular the Secret Service. And again, a screen grab here. The Park Police Incident Commander told us that around mid to late afternoon, the Secret Service UD, I'm not even sure what we're talking about, the Secret Service UDWHB Deputy Chief, Undercover Division probably, White House Bureau Deputy Chief, informed him of the president's potential unscheduled movement to Lafayette Park. And then this part is highlighted here. The U.S. Park Police Incident Commander said the Secret Service Deputy Chief told him that the president's visit would likely occur later that day or in the evening after protesters had been removed from the area. Then goes on to say the Park Police Incident Commander told us that he could not recall the specific time that he learned about the president's potential visit to the park. When we interviewed Park Police Acting Chief of Police, he told us the Park Police Incident Commander told him sometime between 3 and 5 p.m. about the president's potential visit to assess damage to the park, although he could not identify precisely when during that 2-hour period he obtained that information. He confirmed that he learned of the potential visit before the DCNG, DC National Guard, arrived in Lafayette Park at approximately 5 p.m. The Park Police Acting Chief of Police's notes for his testimony before the House Committee on Natural Resources, of all places, Park Police, I guess, Natural Resources, on July 28th, 2020, reflecting that Secret Service advised the Park Police Incident Commander at 4:50 p.m. on June 1st that the president would make this unscheduled visit at some point during the day. The Park Police Acting Chief told us that he could not recall the source for the time in his notes. Both the Park Police Acting Chief and the Park Police Incident Commander stated that they were not told a specific time for the president's potential arrival, etc., etc. Okay, there's a redaction in here too, but we'll move on to the commentary again here. The highlighted text above is important and cuts against the general thrust of the IG report. It shows that the Secret Service was expressly planning for the president's visit to occur after protesters had been removed from the area. This is, of course, a pretty obvious security precaution to take with the president's life. It illuminates something that much of the rest of the report labors to obscure. The expulsion of protesters was a necessary precondition to that photo op happening on that day. As Dave Levitan put it on Twitter, I am not sure there is quite as much distance between tear-gassed protesters for a photo op and took advantage of scheduled tear-gassing of protesters for a photo op, as some people seem to claim that there is. Even more intriguing is the redaction that appears in this section of the IG report, and I guess we ought to read the surrounding text there. The U.S. Park Police Acting Chief of Police also told us that redaction. The Park Police Acting Chief of Police told us the official did not provide him with a reason for the request. He said he rejected the request and reiterated to the official the Park Police's operational plan and stated that the clearing operation would begin once all law enforcement officers under the command of the Park Police were in place. So about that redaction. It obscures what the acting chief told the IG's investigators. We can tell from context that the redacted text concerns a request from an official that the acting chief rejected. We can also pretty confidently infer that the request related to the timing of the clearing operation, since the acting Park Police chief, in his rejection, reiterated his existing plan and explained when the operation would begin. Another sentence with the redaction appears to confirm this interpretation. It's quoted here. We further note that when asked to move up the timeline for clearing the park, redaction, earlier in the afternoon on June 1st, the Park Police acting chief declined to do so. These redactions, therefore, obscure what appears to be a key moment when some official was trying to accelerate the timing of the expulsions for an undisclosed purpose. Was the request made to facilitate the photo op or for some other reason? The report doesn't tell us. And remember, even if it's true that the official hiding behind the redactions wasn't successful in getting the Park Police to change its schedule, this report, by its own terms, wouldn't be able to tell us if other agencies were more amenable to his or her request. There is no explanation in the report for why this significant information is redacted. Knowing who the official was, of course, would help us to investigate whether he or she made any requests or whatever to other law enforcement on the scene. Thirdly, and I hope lastly, unexplained Secret Service decisions. The IG report reveals that the Secret Service took actions that were contrary to the Park Police operational plan, which affected the overall timing and conduct of the clearing operation. The IG report says the Secret Service, contrary to Park Police plan and, without explanation, instigated the violence with protesters within 6 minutes of Barr's visit to the park, which the report says took place at 6:10 p.m. Remember, the IG didn't interview the Secret Service about its independent decision-making, and a separate IG investigation into the Secret Service was quashed. Those points made here in screen grabs. The report then documents how that unexplained decision by the Secret Service then ripples through the rest of the incident. For example, more stuff screen capped here, including this highlighted portion. Somebody, I think the incident commander, told us the plan was thrown off a little bit when the Secret Service deployed early. Now, without an explanation of the early Secret Service deployment, which is outside the scope of this report, we can't rule out the possibility that Trump's schedule determined the timing of the assault on protesters. Without knowing more about the official who was apparently seeking to move up the timing, whose identity and affiliation are mysteriously redacted in the IG report, we can't pursue an important lead that might explain that early deployment. Without an investigation that looks beyond the Park Police to all participants involved in that violent affair, the task the IG report expressly disavows, we can't make particularly meaningful conclusions. The uncertainties left by the report don't mean that we need to overstate our certainty in the other direction. We really don't know why the Secret Service jumped out early. But news headlines should reflect the report's limitations and its deliberate blind spots, not the government's party line. And that seems like a pretty good and solid conclusion. And we can leave it there with respect to what was going on in Lafayette Square Park. Anyway, that is worth doing and worth discussing, that's for sure. And let's see, an awful lot more that we probably need to get to. Well, we'll have to save it mostly for tomorrow and, well, probably the balance of the week as well. And we got to clear out some of these things which were in pocket from before that we did get to. So, okay, let's see. Just for the record, since we won't be able to actually read all the way through it, I will give you this bit o' news. I mean, just in case you were waiting for it. No surprise that it's actually out now. E.J. Dionne, with his column from Saturday, right, the 12th, has this opinion piece, which you may likely have seen over the weekend, but if you didn't and you want to keep up with what E.J. is up to these days, there's no escape, he says, from holding Trump accountable. I mean, there is. You could just not hold him accountable. But that would be bad all by itself. And basically, look, this is E.J. Dionne coming in his own way around to the position that we've had here on the show and prior to the show and prior to my blogging for the most part. And I guess I was already blogging by that point. But it's the argument that we've been making since, 2005. From 2005 through 2010. In written format, and then later on in the show here, ignoring accountability for behavior and criminal behavior at that while in office was just going to lead to more problems. The explicit warning issued to Barack Obama in 2009 on behalf of all of you who followed along with my writing at Daily Kos, that not holding the Bush administration accountable for its challenges, robust challenges to the law, if not outright lawlessness, was basically going to leave the field clear for the next Republican president, whoever it is, to pick up right where the Bush administration left off and do the same or worse. And I don't know whether EJD, I don't think he's even late to this. I think this is just him reiterating his own position from years ago too, but might be worth reading through. And it's always worth reminding everybody, yeah, if you let this stuff go once, twice, 3 times, whether it's Nixon, Ford, Reagan, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, or now Trump, it only gets worse the less you do. And I don't know, maybe it gets worse the more you do too, but at least you'd be doing something. Anyway, speaking of doing something, here's where I will give up the microphone and hand things over to Justice Putnam for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy
from
next.
netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
Hey, what else is on tap here? A federal judge threw out a lawsuit filed by employees of the Houston hospital system. That's the one that Greg mentioned over the mandatory vaccine. The FDA has asked Johnson & Johnson to discard another couple hundred million or whatever, tens of millions of COVID-19 vaccine doses from that manufacturer in Baltimore. Let's find out what's up there next.